Hi everyone, it's Rod at Red Leaf Scale Modeling. And last time we were together, we finished up by putting a nice natural metal finish on the airframe for the Mustang. This time, we're going to complete the model. We'll paint the nose, add the markings, and bring it to life with a little bit of subtle weathering. So, let's get started. As always, before starting any new task, I like to survey the landscape. And sure enough, while inspecting the airframe over a nice cup of coffee, I managed to find a spot right in front of the windscreen where I had damaged the paint. Now, paint flaws cannot be painted out. They need to be sanded out, or the paint needs to be stripped back entirely. But because it's such a small area, and because the paint is so durable, all we need to do is dry sand it. So the area was buffed out using alpha abrasive sanding pads between 3200 and 6000 grit. It was given a quick spritz from the spray can, about a minute with a hairdryer, and the entire repair was complete in about 15 minutes. Our plan was to paint the model the way it's depicted on the box art. So the next thing we're going to do is mask and paint the blue nose. But for accurate information about the layout, we need to refer to the drawings, because what we're really looking for are landmarks, which are any details on the model that can help us get the correct layout, like panel lines or fasteners, even the bottom corners of the canopy frame. So if we start at the bottom corner of the canopy frame, we're going to run a straight line forward down the engine cowl, turn just behind the exhaust stacks, and pick up the panel line that runs under the chin of the airplane. That said, the first tape strip followed the panel line under the engine and then up both sides of the engine cowl so that they just touch the back end of the opening in the fuselage for the exhaust fairings. Very easy, no measurement required. But the lines running forward along the sides of the fuselage require a little more attention. The first landmark is the bottom corner of the sliding canopy frame, and the second is the line of fasteners on the panel immediately in front of the windscreen frame. And very good reference indicates that the edge of the blue paint sits above these fasteners and continues at a slight upward angle as it continues forward until it curves to meet the line that comes up from below the engine. Now what we need to do is add the curved section. And for this, we need a curve of the right radius that crosses the engine cowl at just the right place. The first set of fasteners immediately behind the exhaust fairings. Use whatever you've got to estimate the radius of the curve. I used a circle template because that's what I've got. But with the amount of trial and error that was involved to find just the right circle with the right radius, a coin would have worked just as well. Place the circle so that it just touches the outside edge of both of those straight lines and passes through the area with the two fasteners all at the same time. All three things have to happen at the same time. Once the circle is in the correct position, carefully lift the edge and peel back the strips. Set the circle back into position and lay the tape strips over top of the circle this time. Then carefully cut the ends off the strips where they just touch the edge of the circle to create a nice smooth curve. Things don't always go the way we want them to, which was certainly the case when it came to painting the blue nose. The first step was to paint Tamiya's semi-gloss clear, full strength, at the base of the masking tape where it crossed over the panel lines, to keep the thin paint from wicking under the masking. Then carefully applied 2 coats of the blue, only to find that not only had my plan not worked, but the radius of the curve seemed too tight. So everything was cleaned up, repolished, and remasked, this time using a combination of the yellow kabuki tape and the white vinyl tape, which produced better results overall, but would still require some cleanup. Now obviously I knew this was going to happen to some degree, because I tried to prevent it by painting the semi-gloss clear along the edge of the masking. So now we need to clean things up. The lacquer produces an extremely hard, chemically resistant surface. So in certain areas, we can very carefully scrape away the bulk of the surface deposits. Next, we carefully sand down the raised edge that was created along the masking with a fine grit sanding pad. And finally, we clean up any paint in the recessed panel lines and dress the edges of the blue using a brush and some isopropyl alcohol. And this is another one of those tasks that just takes as long as it takes. There's no rushing this. Actually, the key is to drag the brush very slowly so that the thinner can wake up the paint and the brush will then remove it. Clean the brush frequently on a paper towel, reload with thinner, and repeat the process. It may seem painful, but it's a very important skill to learn, because even when you move up to the airbrush, you're still going to find times when you need to use this skill periodically. In the end, we've got a nice clean edge and we're ready to paint the rest of the details. Naturally, I made another list of next steps, which takes us right out to the end of the project. And the first thing on the list is to paint our details. And this is where our own research and some good references are very important, because some significant details like the fuel caps and the recognition lights under the right wingtip aren't even called out in the instructions. So the paints we're going to use are X7 Gloss Red, clear red, clear green, clear orange, and X10 gunmetal per the instructions for the machine gun barrels. The fuel caps on the fuselage, wings, and drop tanks were painted in a gloss red, as indicated on the color plates from Planes in Profile. Then, using clear red and referring to the same artwork, we picked out the formation lights on the wingtip, left side of fuselage, and the recognition light underneath the right wingtip. The right wingtip formation light and the middle recognition light were picked out using the clear green, clear orange for the aft recognition light, and gunmetal to pick out the gun barrels. Remember to brace your hands and even lock your fingers together for better control of the tip of the brush. And to control the flow of paint, I find it best to start in the center of a detail and work toward the edges. This way, if the paint does decide to flow, it typically doesn't go past the edge. But it still does. So the last step is to clean up all the edges with some isopropyl alcohol. Now this works because we base coated the model with a high gloss lacquer, which means there's a clear gloss component in the paint, and the lacquer means that it's chemically resistant to the alcohol that we're using over top of it. But it's the smooth surface that allows us to simply wipe away the excess paint. Had we started with a flat lacquer or an acrylic, this would only be possible if we gave the model a gloss or semi-gloss clear coat with a lacquer. So don't lose your nerve. Even if the paint doesn't go down so well at the beginning, with a little TLC, you can make it look really good by the end. To get ready for the first clear coat, the underwing pylons, radiator rear shutter, and the tail wheel were all installed, and the main gear doors and the strut covers were carefully removed to open up the main gear bays. And the U-Hoo tack sticks to itself, so the easiest way to remove it is with a ball of U-Hoo tack. In my opinion, this first clear coat is very important because it protects all the work that we've done to this point, and it sets us up for everything we want to do going forward. And the semi-gloss provides just enough sheen and a smooth enough surface to make it easy to apply the decals on areas like the propeller blades or to apply the weathering in the main wheel wells. And the rattle can makes it so easy. Total spraying time on the airframe was less than 60 seconds. A hairdryer was used to accelerate the drying time a little bit, and then it was placed in a custom cradle until the small parts were sprayed. Now, as we watch the small parts being sprayed, remember, safety first. These particular sprays are synthetic lacquers, and they've been banned in Canada since January 2025 because they produce some very serious gases. But it doesn't matter what we spray, because anything coming out of a can or an airbrush is atomized. That means the gases and the particles are going to go into your lungs. So make sure you've got some way to breathe fresh air, whether it's an extraction system, a half-face respirator, or maybe you can work in an outdoor space. Once everything is sprayed, set it aside and cover it to keep the dust off it, and we're going to prepare the decals. Once again, we're going to put together a plan, because our decal sheets give us enough decals for 4 aircraft. So the first thing we're going to do is check the drawings, find out which decals we need, and where they're supposed to go. When we look at the drawing for the aircraft that we want to model, the decals are indicated by a number inside a small circle. And it shouldn't be any surprise with Tamiya's attention to detail that the decals on the decal sheet are numbered in exactly the same way, a small number in a circle. A good plan will consider how we're going to prop the model up so we can work on it, how we're going to manipulate it so we can change the position of it, and how we're going to organize the work so we don't drive ourselves crazy. Now, to prop the model up, there are plenty of custom supports available online, or you can get creative with something around the house, like this plastic food container. Where we hold the model is going to be important because we won't be putting decals there until much later in the process, which in this case was either side of the fuselage by the cockpit. And to stay organized, we can focus on one area at a time, like this example where we look at the right rear fuselage from the stars and bars back to the rudder. When we look at the drawings for decal placement, we're looking for 2 things. First is overlap. Any situation where one decal must go down before the other, and the second is going to overlap it either entirely or partially. The second thing we're looking for is landmarks. Does the decal run parallel to a panel line or a joint? Or how is the decal centered or oriented within a space? For example, here, the M is running parallel to the joint between the tail and the rudder, and the clearance appears to be the same up the vertical joint and across the top at the hinge for the rudder. Now, if we organize the work by area, like the right rear portion of the fuselage that we mentioned, a lot of time can be saved by cutting out all the decals ahead of time and then organizing them in any way that makes sense to you. They can be paired up, arranged in order numerically, or, as we've done here, group them together by area, like the right rear portion of the fuselage. These kits were designed for beginners, so the decals that came with them were, in a word, robust. So after lots of frustration and equal amounts of research, here's the application technique that seems to work best. First, dip them in hot water from the tap, not boiling, about 105 degrees, for about 10 to 12 seconds, or until they start moving freely on the backing paper, whichever comes first. Wet the area that's to receive the decal with a little bit of Mr. Mark Setter. Slide the decal off the backing paper and into its approximate position. Fine-tune the decals position with maybe a wet fingertip, a moist paintbrush, or a toothpick. Wick away excess moisture with a paper towel or maybe even a dry cotton swab. And then I prefer to use a dry cotton swab to roll or push moisture out from underneath the decal, usually from the center out towards the edge. Sharpen up any panel lines with the tip of a needle, and then finish with one last coat of Mr. Mark Setter. Once an area is done, highlight it on the drawings and then move to the next. Sometimes decals don't behave the way we expect them to, like this one. So let's take a look at how to fix this. Now we got a combination of small bubbles, one large bubble, and a good wrinkle right across the actuator. So we'll start the process by sanding with a 3200 grit. The idea is just to knock down the tops of these bubbles and get everything flat. Now we want to restore that nice dark blue. And you don't really need a color wheel for this. It's a pretty simple mix, but if you're going to be doing any amount of painting, it's a great little tool to have. So we're going to mix X18 semi-gloss black with the X4 blue, and we're going to do it little by little, comparing it to the color that's on the decal until we get exactly the right shade. And 3 mixes later, we are ready to paint. Thin the paint to a watery consistency, like a glaze. Load a brush so that it's wet, not dripping, and then very carefully paint directly over the damaged portions of the decal. Work from the center out and blend the damaged portions into the good areas. Repeat this process as many times as necessary until the color of the area being repaired is consistent, which in this case took 3 applications. Acrylics are excellent for this. They have very strong pigments and the opacity builds up very quickly. Once they're dry, we're going to dry sand them smooth with a 3200 grit, 4000 grit, and 6000 grit micromesh cushioned abrasive sheets, which are fabric-backed sanders as opposed to a paper-backed sanding sheet. Check your work often, critique it honestly, and repeat the process until you get the results you expect. Once all the decals are in position and any necessary repairs have been completed, we'll seal them with a top coat of semi-gloss clear. But we can still see the raised edge of the decal, and we really need to fix that. And all that's required is some very careful sanding with a fine grit abrasive. In this case, a narrow strip of 3200 grit micromesh cushioned abrasive. Carefully work along the edges of the decal until the reflectivity changes from a glassy finish to a flat finish. It's easy, it's quick, and the results are absolutely amazing. Now, unify everything with one more thin coat of semi-gloss clear, and we're ready to start weathering. At this point, we've cleaned up the paint and the markings, and we've given the model a clear coat, or a barrier coat, with Tamiya's TS79 semi-gloss clear lacquer from the spray can. And while the model is nice and clean, it looks like a toy. So we're going to give it a slightly more realistic appearance using Tamiya's panel liners. And very easily go from this to this, and it's much easier than you may think. As always, it's important to understand exactly what we want to achieve before we start the process. So when we look at photographs of a real machine, both period photographs and a restored airplane, the panel lines are crisp, but they're very subtle. They're visible, but from a reasonable distance, and that's the effect that we're shooting for. So if you're new to weathering, we're going to keep it subtle and simple by using one product type to create 3 different effects. We'll start with a pin wash to highlight panel lines and details. Then we'll add a second layer of general grime, and finally we'll add some streaks. As always, safety first. These are enamel-based products, so before getting started, make sure your area is well ventilated. Now the process is very simple. We want to shake it well before we start, brush it on, allow it to dry, and then blend it. So let's slow things down a little bit and take a closer look at what's involved. The panel liners are very thin enamel paints, so it's important to shake them well before starting and about every 15 minutes during the application, which will keep the pigment suspended in the carrier. Each of the panel liners comes with a tiny brush attached under the cap. As the brush comes up out of the bottle, remove any excess material from the handle of the brush along the neck of the bottle. Then carefully brush the material into position exactly where you want it, with a reasonable amount of accuracy. It doesn't need to be perfect, but don't allow it to pool or build up large concentrations in deep recesses or around raised details. The excess thinner can damage your paint or surface preparation, and as large concentrations dry, they can crack. Step 3, let it dry. Tamiya's recommendation is to let the liner dry for 15 to 20 minutes before beginning cleanup. And this is very important because it doesn't matter whether it's 15 minutes, 1 hour, 1 day, or 1 week, dry is dry. We can come back anytime in the future and revive this material with Tamiya's X20A enamel thinner, mineral spirits, or lighter fluid, and begin blending. So the message here is that there's no rush. So start in a logical place on the model, like the belly. Then work around the model area by area. By the time all the liner has been laid in, the area you started with should be dry, and you should be able to just start blending. And this is what the technique looks like in real time. The swab is barely moist with Tamiya X20 enamel thinner, and the panel liner is dry. So the first step is to gently roll the swab along the surface until the panel liner begins to reactivate, which is easy to recognize because the swab will start pulling some of the material off the surface. And this is the critical point, moist enough that we can work it, but so close to being dry that it'll dry out within seconds. At this point, we have 3 different techniques that we can use. First is a rolling motion that we can use to blend. The second is a tapping motion that we can use to blend. And the third is a wiping motion that will literally clean the surface. I move the swab very quickly, just gliding over the surface with virtually no pressure on the surface at all. Do a small amount of work and then jump to another area to let the current area dry. And just cycle through the different areas using these different techniques until you get the effect that you want, which, by the way, happens very quickly. Now the pin wash is our first layer of weathering, and what we're doing is creating fake shadows in and around raised and recessed details. And this is one more reason why a good quality kit is so important, because it has the right amount of detail and the right type of detail to allow you to develop your painting skills. So if you're just getting your start in weathering your models, this is the one product I would recommend and the one technique I would recommend, because the panel liner is so easy to use, and the pin wash is the one technique that has the greatest impact on the visual appearance of your models. Use a brush to work on areas that can't be easily reached with a cotton swab, like this wedge-shaped step that didn't exist on the real flaps, but which does give visual interest to the part. We'll go back to the swab on the surface of the flaps, but we'll change our approach slightly. We start by reviving the panel liner along the upper edge with a gentle tapping motion. Then, using very little pressure and irregular movements, we want to pull mostly from top to bottom or in the direction of airflow to leave behind a very subtle, irregular, grimy appearance. Like this over and under comparison with our finished piece on the bottom. And the brush is definitely our best option when it comes to highlighting each of the ridges on the fabric-covered rudder. The panel liner was very carefully brushed in just below the crest of each of the ridges. Once dry, we use the brush to carefully shape and blend those shadows until we get the desired effect. We use a gentle tapping motion with the side of the bristles, or a very subtle brushing motion with the tip of the bristles to revive the panel liner and begin blending the edge. But we can also sweep the bristles side to side whenever we want to get a much sharper edge, like cleaning up the upper half of each ridge from its base up to the crest line. Again, repeat the process until you get a result you're happy with. Weathering is all about layering, so now we're going to add our second layer, the grime layer. We're going to use the dark brown panel liner, and we're going to build up certain areas that would naturally accumulate more grime than others. And we use all of the same techniques that we used for the first layer, the panel lines. But there are 2 things we need to keep in mind. First, when we lay in the grime layer, we want to achieve balance across the surface of the model, not symmetry. For example, if we're working behind the wheel wells, we don't want to do exactly the same techniques in the same places to the same extent and the same intensity across both sides of the fuselage. There will be grime behind each of the wheel wells on each side of the fuselage, but it should be irregular and balanced, not symmetrical. The second is a reminder that the panel liners are semi-permanent, and the thinner we use to activate the top layer will also activate any previous layers. So we need to be a bit more careful when we work with a top layer that's directly over a previous layer. And a rolling or tapping technique is easily the best option in this situation. And you can see in this example that we've got grime buildup behind both of the main gear bays, with a heavier concentration behind the right gear bay. And I'm using both a rolling and a tapping technique to create different effects in different areas. Irregular buildups in logical locations that are balanced on either side of the center line of the fuselage. On small parts or in hard-to-reach areas where more control and more finesse is required, a brush offers much more control over the effects we create. For example, on the hub of the wheel, we can create very subtle radial streaks, which are consistent with a machine part that rotates. Again, start at the outside edge and work very carefully towards the center, leaving behind pigment deposits that produce the weathering effect you're trying to create. So on the main landing gear strut, the blending was carried down to a point where we created more of a patina or a staining on the main portions of the strut, with subtle oily, grimy deposits at all the transitions and around all of the main details on the part. Now for our third layer, or third effect, we're going to create some streaks. And these can be anything you want: oil leaks, coolant leaks, or a little bit of grime. And we're going to keep it very subtle. In each case, we start with a tiny line or dot of panel liner, let it dry, and then with a barely moistened swab, we're going to begin blending from each edge to the center and from the base to the tip to create streaks of different length and different intensity. And behind the tail wheel, we blended it out until we were left with a tiny bit of grime. But behind the main wheel well, we want something that looks a little bit more like an oil leak. So we blended it to a triangular shape using a very gentle flicking motion with the swab, so as not to reactivate the previous layer. But on the radiator rear shutter, we want to create the effect of a small amount of coolant flowing over the surface in the direction of airflow. So we want to create some streaks that are well defined and with much more intensity. To create these types of streaks, we start with a pointed brush that's barely moist, and hold the model so you can rotate it easily, allowing you to work from both sides. Work along each side of the streak, blending from the outside edge to the center, keeping the bristles roughly perpendicular to the center line of the streak. Then, drawing mostly from the base out to the tip, or in the direction of airflow, adjust the length, width, and intensity of each streak. Initially, with a freshly moistened brush, the panel liner reactivates and the pigment begins to move very easily. This is the wet state, and this is when we create some very intense streaks, very opaque with very crisp edges. But the enamel thinner evaporates very quickly, both in the brush and from the panel liner that's on the surface of the model. And as it does, we approach the dry state. And this is the critical point. As everything is drying out and the pigment is starting to resist movement, we can create some very subtle effects. We can feather the edges of the main streak, or by using the pigment that was picked up on the tip of the brush, create some beautiful secondary streaks or stains, without having to apply any additional material. And again, if you don't like the result, just brush it off and try again. In my opinion, the panel liners are absolutely the best choice for anyone that's just learning to weather their models. First, there's the convenience of a pre-mixed product with its own applicator brush. This means there's no setup time, mixing, or cleanup time. Simply shake it up, brush it on, put the cap back on the bottle. Second is that it's semi-permanent, which makes it so easy to use. Just shake it up, brush it on, let it dry, and then blend it. But there's no time pressure. You can blend it in 15 minutes or 15 days. And if you don't like what you've created, wipe it off and try again. You cannot fail. Third is again the fact that it's semi-permanent, which makes layering, when we literally put one effect over top of another, a bit of a challenge. So it's important for us to understand the properties of the material we're working with, and then modify our techniques so that we get the best out of the product and ultimately create the effects that we want. But in the end, it's all about practice. Point number 4 is the color range. Now the panel liners are enamel based, and while there's only 9 shades available, it's important to note that Tamiya's entire enamel paint range obeys the same properties and can be weathered using exactly the same techniques that we just saw for the panel liners. This means you now have access to a significant number of authentic military colors, all of the primary colors, and the earth tones, which were actually used to weather the tires on this model. So this means there's no limit to the colors you can create. And if all of that wasn't enough, point number 5 is that all of the techniques that we just looked at are fully transferable to oils and acrylics. That makes the panel liners the perfect stepping stone to the more advanced weathering techniques. So if you've never tried weathering before, or you're just getting started, I strongly encourage you to try the panel liners because they make it so easy to get great results. When the canopy masking was removed and I noticed paint had worked its way up onto the clear sections, I immediately recognized it as a happy accident, because what better way is there to demonstrate a canopy repair than to actually do a canopy repair? The blue acrylic came off easily with a brush and some isopropyl alcohol, but the metallic lacquer was going to need to be scraped or sanded and then polished out. Now the work area is very small, not unlike sanding out an ejector pin mark in a very tight spot. But because most of the work is going to happen immediately beside the canopy frames, it is going to be much more tedious. So in this case, getting a good result is all about setup. So we're going to make some custom sanding tools made from small swatches of fine abrasive sponges and sheets with a pair of self-closing tweezers as a handle. And we're going to use the same fundamentals for sanding and polishing that we used on the fuselage, namely using the abrasive from different directions so we don't alter the shape of the part. And because it's on a much smaller scale, we also want to incorporate the fundamentals regarding fine detail work, which means optical magnification if you need it. Then get into a comfortable working position. Brace your forearms against your bench and then lock your hands and fingers together, which gives you maximum control over the movement of the tool. Then relax, be patient, and start the process. I started the process with a small chunk of Tamiya's 1500 grit foam sanding pad. To make the tool, cut a small chunk of foam about 2 millimeters wide by 4 millimeters long. Then simply clamp it in the tweezers. But take care to pinch the foam far enough behind the abrasive sheet to not distort it. The surface of the abrasive sheet should be flat, not bulged. The heaviest work needs to be done right beside the canopy frames, so I elected to go with 1500 grit to get maximum cut with minimum pressure. This translates to much more control over the edges of the sanding pad and much more control along the edges of the canopy frame. But it also destroys the clarity of the part, so this is when it's critically important to keep your nerve, suppress the terror that you feel, and trust the process. The second pass was made with a chunk of Tamiya's 3000 grit foam sanding pad for the same reasons as the first. And while it appears we may be making things worse, we can feel an increase in the resistance to the abrasive on the surface. And that's the feedback that tells us we're actually making the surface smoother. That's how we know when it's time to move on to the micromesh polishing abrasives. To create a custom sanding tool with the micromesh, cut a small strip about 2 to 3 millimeters wide and 4 to 6 millimeters long. Fold it over to create a small loop, not a sharp edge, and when you pinch it in the tweezers, leave a small barrel about 1 to 2 millimeters in diameter. Polishing started with the 3200 grit micromesh, and in this close-up sequence you'll notice two things. First, my fingers are stabilized. The model is snuggled comfortably into my left hand, and then the fingers of my right hand are stabilized against the fingertips of my left hand or on the surface of the model, or both. This provides maximum control of the tip of the tool and brings us to the second point, which is the small circular motion, which is perfect for polishing. And this will be our technique going forward. Now the next micromesh is the 4000 grit, and you can see right away that the work area is getting a little bit larger. And that's because every time we move up to the next abrasive, we have to carry out a little bit further to polish out the scratches left behind by the previous abrasive. But even this early in the process, you can already see the clarity of the canopy starting to come back. And all we have left are the 6, the 8, and the 12,000 grit. Once we get into the 6000 grit, we notice a major change in both the appearance of the canopy and the feel of the abrasive on the surface. The canopy is obviously getting clearer, but as it does, it gets smoother, and the feel of the abrasive on the surface is a lot like rubber on glass. And it's these two feedbacks in combination that tell you you've reached the limit of the 6000 grit. No matter how much polishing you do, the canopy will not get any clearer. And that's how you know it's time to move up to the 8000 grit. By the time we get to the 8000 grit, it's all about polish. The canopy is already very smooth, so all we're doing at this point is removing micro scratches and improving the clarity. The technique is the same and the results look great, but there's just one more step to go. The 12,000 grit is the true polishing stage, and at this point everything becomes very clear, pun intended. The canopy will become virtually crystal clear, but so too will the techniques and the process that we use to achieve it. So when the details in the cockpit come into sharp focus, we're done. Start to finish, it took about 1 hour to restore the clarity of the canopy, which isn't really that long when you consider the number of steps that were involved. But being able to clean up the clear parts is about far more than just repair work. It's one of the fundamental skills of scale modeling, because there are several situations when it'll be necessary. Sometimes it's our fault, and they get damaged when they're on the bench or when we handle them, or despite our best efforts, we manage to get paint on them, which was the case here. Sometimes they come to us in a brand new box, having been damaged during shipping. But in some cases, they actually get molded with a seam down the middle that needs to be cleaned up as part of the build process, like the canopy for Tamiya's beautiful 1/48 scale F16. So knowing how to clean up the clear parts is for more than just cleaning up our mistakes. It's an essential skill. Now we can finish up the assembly of the model by adding all of the detail parts, which have already been weathered. And the thinking was that it would make it easier to work on the parts themselves when they were not attached to the model, but it would also reduce the amount of handling and possible breakage if we tried to weather them when they were on the model. So it's worth taking a quick minute to plan the next series of moves. And it should be very simple. We look at which parts we've got left, how big they are, how delicate they are, where they go, how hard it's going to be to install them, and then put together a sort of a logical sequence that allows us to install the parts, move the model around to get the next parts on, and not break off all the stuff that we already put on. The landing light went in first because it's tiny, it's fiddly to install, and to be honest, I didn't want to forget to install it. Next up was the main landing gear struts with the wheels and tires. These are going to carry the weight of the model, so I wanted to give the cement as much time to cure as possible to get a nice strong bond. Use very little cement, set the parts as accurately as possible, and then continue to tweak the alignment as the cement cures, which happens fairly quickly. And it's a good idea to have some way to support the model, like our plastic food container, until the struts have fully cured. Once the paint was scraped off the mating surface at the opening to the cooling tunnel, the lip was cemented in place. And this was followed by the main landing gear doors and the actuators. First, both main doors were cemented into position. Then, working very quickly, one side at a time, each actuator was set first at the bottom and then at the top as a way of both adjusting and bracing the main doors. Leaving the strut covers off until now meant that the small pin at the top end needed to be trimmed back slightly so that they would fit properly. The flaps sit comfortably in position with a nice friction fit, and the propeller simply slips over the axle and is held in place by the polycap hidden within the spinner. To fit the pitot tube, the decal over the opening was very carefully cut away, a small drop of cement was added, and the pitot tube was fitted using a pair of tweezers. The drop tanks were installed on their respective pylons, and finally, the antenna mast was fastened to the spine of the airplane, making sure that it was turned in the proper direction and projecting from the top of the fuselage at the correct angle. And with that, assembly of the model is complete. But when we take one last look at the model to see if there's anything we've missed, one thing jumps out at us. We need to add some weathering to those tires. To weather the tires, we're going to use Tamiya's XF57 Buff enamel paint to demonstrate just how easy it is to go from this to this, even if this is your very first attempt at weathering. As always, set up the work area so that it's comfortable and organized. Everything you need should be within easy reach. Shake the paint well, and then meter out 2, maybe 3 drops on a paint palette, which is all you're going to need. The first technique we're going to use is a wash, a watery thin mixture that's mostly thinner with a little bit of paint. And this is going to change the appearance of the tires from that shiny black to a much more natural, dusty, dark gray look. To create the wash, load the brush with thinner and then just touch the edge of the paint to pick up a little bit of the pigment. Then mix what's on the brush on a clean part of the palette. And that's all there is to it. And there's 2 reasons for doing it this way. First, that's more than enough wash to coat the tires. And second, after the wash has been allowed to dry for about 10 or 15 minutes, we're going to come back with a moistened cotton swab or a brush and start to blend it. Then we're going to want to use the thicker paint to create the next effect. The wash is the first layer or weathering effect that we add to the model. So for the second effect, we're going to create some radial streaks using the larger brush with the coarser bristles. After the wash has had about 15 minutes to dry, we moisten the brush and then very gently sweep across the sidewalls of the tires, drawing the brush outward radially from the center. And this produces some very subtle but convincing radial streaks along the sidewalls of the tires. And different effects can be created by simply changing the angle of the brush or using a different brush. The third thing we're going to do is add the impression of dried mud or dirt right along the shoulder of the tread pattern, similar to what we see highlighted here in the photo. This time we're going to use the pointed brush with the thicker paint, which should give us a lot more control over the placement of the paint, the opacity of the paint, and possibly even a bit more texture. Start the process by painting a rough ring around the inside and outside of each tire, right where the outside edge of the shoulder of the tread pattern meets the sidewall, taking care to create a scale but rough edge along the inside edge of each loop. In other words, the edge that's up along the sidewall of the tire. After about 10 or 15 minutes of drying time, start blending the bottom edge of those rings into the contact surface of the blocks of the tread pattern. So the effect that I'm trying to create, and the one that I prefer, is what we see in this photograph of a truck tire on a job site, where the contact surface of the blocks in the tread pattern actually appear lighter than the grooves in the tread pattern. And to try to achieve this effect, I prefer to use a moistened cotton swab and a rolling or tapping action. As the paint is revived, the pigment gets held in the fibers of the swab. Then, blending from the outer edge of the tread pattern towards the center, the pigment is redistributed across the surface of the blocks in the tread pattern. Now it's not perfect, but it's not that bad either. And if you're just getting started weathering, it doesn't get any easier than these products and these techniques. I think it's a pretty good place to start. And here is our finished model. Now these videos were created for the beginner from a beginner's perspective, which means I used basic tools with fundamental techniques. And the idea was to demonstrate to the beginner that good results are possible with a basic set of tools if you understand and use the fundamentals of scale modeling. Now these are the foundations of everything that we literally build on. They're used from beginner to master. The big difference is that a master has literally mastered the fundamentals and then some. Now, some of the techniques that were presented, like painting your model with a spray can or weathering with Tamiya's panel liners and enamel paints, are strongly recommended because they are so easy and the results are so amazing. Now, others, like blending your decals by clear coating them and then sanding them flush, are optional. They're still recommended, but if you don't use that technique now, at least there's an awareness of how to do it. So I hope you found these videos helpful. And if you did, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment, because that's what fuels this channel. Again, thank you so much. Happy modeling. I'll see you in the next one.